The night smelled like pine needles and burnt sugar, the kind of scent that only shows up when December is trying too hard to feel warm. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling of the rented hall, slightly crooked, taped by hands that meant well but were tired. Laughter moved in waves, loud near the buffet table, softer near the windows where the cold pressed its face against the glass. It was supposed to be a Christmas party, the kind where people loosen their shoulders, forget their worries for a few hours, and pretend that next year will be gentler than the last. She stood near the back, holding a thin manila folder against her chest as if it were a shield. Her red dress was simple, elegant without trying, but no one noticed that. What they noticed was her face, how her eyes were swollen, how she kept blinking as if the lights were too bright, how her mouth trembled when someone said her name. Most assumed she was just another woman having a bad year, another marriage that couldn't survive the quiet erosion of misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. Someone clinked a glass for attention, and the room leaned forward. A toast was made about teamwork, about loyalty, about family, words that can sound comforting or cruel depending on the timing. As applause rippled through the crowd, she slipped the folder open. The papers inside were crisp, official, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with their weight. Divorce papers, signed moments ago in a small office down the street, the ink barely dry, the finality still echoing in her ears. Her tears fell silently, landing on the edge of the folder, blurring a line of text. No one saw that either. They were busy hugging, laughing, raising phones for photos, promising to catch up in the new year. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed how she didn't reach for the champagne, how she flinched when someone brushed past her, how she kept glancing at the exit like a swimmer scanning for shore. Years ago, she had imagined this moment differently. She had believed that endings would be loud, explosive, undeniable. Instead, it felt like standing in a crowded room where no one could hear you whisper goodbye to the life you thought you'd have. The irony was almost unbearable. She had spent so much of her marriage trying to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to love, and now that it was over, she was invisible anyway. A co-worker, young, earnest, wearing a sweater with blinking lights, approached her with a plate of cookies. "You okay?" the co-worker asked, voice gentle but distracted, already half turned back toward the laughter. She nodded, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said she just needed some air. The coworker nodded back, relieved not to be needed, and disappeared into the noise. Outside, the cold hit her like truth. Sharp, honest. She breathed in deeply, letting the ache in her chest expand and then settle. Her phone buzzed in her purse, messages she didn't open, calls she didn't answer. There were people who knew who she really was, who knew the scale of her resources, the reach of her name in rooms far grander than this one. But here, tonight, none of that mattered. Or maybe it mattered too much. She had learned early that money can be a wall as much as a bridge. It changes the way people look at you, the way they listen, the way they touch. She had wanted to be loved without the weight of numbers attached to her name, without balance sheets and headlines. So she kept that part of her life carefully folded away, like a letter you never send. When she married, she didn't lead with what she had. She led with who she was, or who she hoped she was allowed to be. At first, it worked, or seemed to. There were dinners cooked together, late-night talks about dreams, shared jokes that felt like secrets. But slowly, cracks formed. Not because of money, not directly, but because of pride, fear, and the quiet resentment that grows when two people are afraid to be fully honest. He wanted to be the provider, the strong one, the anchor. She wanted to protect him from a truth she thought would only hurt. Each act of kindness became, unknowingly, another brick in the wall between them. Inside the hall, the music shifted to something nostalgic, a song about home, about coming back. She closed her eyes and let the sound drift through the door, mixing with the cold air. She thought about all the time she had given anonymously, all the checks written under different names, all the problems solved quietly, because she believed kindness didn't need applause. She thought about the scholarship fund that carried her grandmother's maiden name, the hospital wing dedicated without a ceremony, the families who would never know why their debts disappeared overnight. None of that comforted her right now. Wealth is powerful, but it is not a blanket against grief. It cannot tuck you in when your heart is breaking. It cannot sit beside you and say, I see you. In this moment, she would have traded every asset she owned for one honest conversation that didn't end in signatures. The door opened behind her. An older woman stepped out, wrapped in a wool coat that had seen many winters. She held 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, the woman said, offering one. There was no pity in her eyes, just recognition. The kind that comes from having lived long enough to know that tears don't always need explanations. Thank you, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood together without speaking for a while, watching their breath turn into clouds. Finally, the older woman said, Christmas parties can be hard. They pretend everything is wrapped up nicely, but life doesn't work that way. She nodded, surprised by the sting of tears returning. I didn't think it would end like this. Most endings don't look the way we imagine, the woman said. But that doesn't mean they're the end of the story. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they settled into her chest with a warmth the coffee couldn't provide. Kindness often arrives like that. Not grand, not dramatic, just present. She thanked the woman again. And when the door opened and closed, she was alone once more, but less so than before. Back inside, someone announced a gift exchange. Names were called. Laughter erupted over mismatched presents. She slipped back in quietly, taking a seat near the edge of the room. The folder rested at her feet now, no longer clutched like a lifeline, just there, a fact instead of a wound. She watched people open gifts they hadn't known they'd receive, their surprise genuine, their gratitude unpolished. A small thought surfaced, tentative but persistent. What if tonight didn't have to be only about what she lost? What if, even in this rawness, there was space to give something real, not money, not solutions, but presence? She noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the wall, staring at his phone with the same hollow look she had seen in the mirror earlier. She noticed a woman in the corner, wiping her eyes quickly whenever someone walked past. She noticed the way the janitor moved quietly, efficiently, invisible despite being essential. For the first time all evening, she felt the faintest shift inside her, like ice cracking under cautious footsteps. When her name was called for the gift exchange, there was a brief, awkward pause. She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the center. The gift she received was small, wrapped in brown paper with twine. Inside was a handwritten card and a candle that smelled like vanilla and cedar. The card read, "For light when things feel dark." She didn't know who had written it. Maybe they didn't know either, not really. Maybe they had just followed a feeling. She returned to her seat, blinking back tears, this time not entirely from pain. The room felt different now. Or maybe she did. She leaned down, picked up the folder, and slid it into her bag. Not hidden, not denied, just placed where it belonged for the moment. As the party wore on, conversations softened. People began sharing stories they hadn't planned to tell. Regrets surfaced, hopes too. She listened more than she spoke, offering nods, small smiles, the kind of attention that says, your story matters. It was a skill she had practiced for years, long before money complicated things. It felt like coming home to herself. Near the end of the night, the young coworker with the blinking sweater approached again, this time without the frantic energy. "I'm glad you stayed," the coworker said. "It wouldn't have felt right if you'd left." She smiled, genuinely this time. "I'm glad too." Outside, snow had begun to fall, softening the edges of the world. She stepped into it, slowly, letting flakes land on her hair, her shoulders, her lashes. The future was still uncertain. The pain was still real. The papers were still signed. But something else was there now, something quieter and stronger than despair. She walked toward her car, the sounds of the party fading behind her, and for the first time since the pen left the page, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by what had ended, but by what she might choose next, by the ways kindness could still move through her hands, by the possibility that being unseen tonight did not mean she was unknown to the world, only that there were chapters yet unwritten, moments of grace waiting in ordinary places, and choices that would ask her not who she had been or what she possessed, but how she would show up when the decorations came down and the lights were turned off, when the cold returned in earnest and the quiet demanded honesty, when the weight of silence pressed in, and she would have to decide whether to retreat into protection or step forward into a generosity that did not require explanation, applause, or permission. A generosity that could begin with something as simple as staying, listening, and letting the night pass without pretending it had not changed her at all.